Let's talk a bit about translating objects as well as snaps. So what snaps we have available to us, how we snap from one object to another, snapping on the grid. We'll talk a little bit about the tools as well as some methods for freezing transformations. So how do you like reset a transformation once it's been moved, reset it to zero, and kind of quick workarounds on how to have better control of manipulating your objects. So first thing I'm going to do is either going to go up to the shelf, and you can go to the polygon tab and click on the polygon cube. Or like we spoke about earlier, we can go to create polygon primitives cube. Or we can also hold the spacebar and go to create polygon primitive, and I'm just going to pick the cube. And it's just going to snap here. If some of you are creating the polygon primitive and you notice at the bottom if it says interactive creation, if that is turned on, and you notice I'll prompt you drag the base on the grid, then pull up. So anywhere that you drag, as soon as you let go, I'm holding the left mouse button, as soon as you let go, it's going to say drag up to set height, and you created the cube based on whatever position you wanted and the height that you wanted. So if you turn off, hold the spacebar, go to create polygon primitive. If you check interactive creation off, then it will create the geometry based around the 0, 0, 0. And you'll notice right away that if you try to move this, you actually can't. This polygon object, you can just select it. You're not able to actually move it anywhere. And that's because the select tool is what's set right now, not the move tool. And so I'm going to go ahead and talk about the 3 hotkeys that are going to make your life incredibly easy. And that's the W, the E, and the R. And you can see that the manipulator changes every time you do that. By default, you probably had it set to Q, and Q is the selection tool. And the selection tool allows you to select, basically select any objects or any geometry without accidentally moving it. And this will make more sense as we get further into this. But if you look up at the toolbox, you can also see that when you are toggling between W, E, and R, that the toolbox is displaying the tool that's being selected. So in this case, the move tool, the rotate tool, and the scale tool. It's the same thing as going up and clicking each one of these. But it's not as effective to have to go up every time you'd like to make a translation. I mean, that's what these 3 keys are essentially for. And it's located pretty nicely. It's, on your left hand, you're going to have your hand on the Alt key anyway. So these are here basically for you to toggle between. And then the Q, like I said earlier, will go back to selection mode. So once we have the move tool selected, you can see that it's displaying 3 axes that are based on your coordinate system. So you have, on the blue side, you have the Z, the X, and the Y. Unless, of course, you have the Z up, in which case the Z would be up, and then you'd have your X and Y. So how do we go about translating this object? So if you grab any of the arrows and just drag it along, you'll start moving the object along that axis. And you'll notice in your channel box that the translate X, the numbers, the values are changing. And that's because you're moving it along that axis. Same thing if you move it along the Z axis, then those will change as well, but you notice the other ones are remaining still. And then the Y, of course, you go up and down. So if you wanted to move it without the specific axes, you can grab it by the middle. And if you grab the manipulator by that square and you just move it around, you have a free transform, basically. You can just drag it and move it anywhere, and you notice that all of your translate X, Y, and Z's are changing. So that's great. Of course, that's not very accurate, and if you're trying to move at specific units, then you'd have to go about this a little bit differently. To specify specific number of units, you can do it a couple of different ways. First, let's go back to, if you click and drag all the translates, you can click and drag any of these and specify a value that will be placed along all of them. If you click and drag the translate X, Y, and Z and just hit 0, it's going to place it back to the position it came from because it's setting it to 0, 0, 0. So if I want to move this, let's say 10 units along the X, instead of basically just moving it until it finally gets to 10, I can just type the number 10 and it will get it to that unit. You can also go to your move tool settings, and we'll get a little bit further into the tool settings when we start dealing with the polygon modeling section. So if you double click the move tool, you remember from before the tool settings, you'll get the move tool settings that are all going to be here, and there's a lot of other options that we'll get into a bit later as well. But if you notice down at the bottom of the settings, the discrete move, if you select that and you specify an increment, the steps I say we do 5, then when you try to move the polygon object, it's going to move every 5 units. It's basically a snap that's happening every 5 units. And you can see here that it's doing that. So if you know that you're moving something incrementally, you could do it that way. I'll go ahead and turn that off. And don't worry about, make sure it's on the world axis for now. We'll talk about these a bit later, especially when we get into component mode. And I'm going to go ahead and set this to 0 and bring it back. So that's for the move tool. If we hit E, then we'll see the rotate tool manipulator will come up. And the same thing, so if you grab the blue axis, you'll notice that the rotate Z is changing, only the Z, no matter where your mouse is. I'm clicking and holding the left mouse button. I'm going to undo that by doing Command Z for Mac or Control Z in PC. You can also do Control Z in Mac as well. So if we grab the red, you notice that the rotate X is moving. Same thing, we can grab the channel box and type a specific number and it will rotate that specific number of units. I'm going to set that back to 0. And then the outermost one, the little blue area here, that's basically on the camera plane. So you're rotating along that camera plane, wherever the camera is. And you can see that all of them are changing, the X, Y, and Z, because you're not specifying one specific axis. You can also grab anywhere between the axes and just click and hold, and that'll be a free rotation axis. So you can go ahead and just drag it left, whichever direction you want, and you notice that your channel box is jumping around like crazy. And this could be, it's not obviously not very specific and useful when you're trying to do something that is in relation to another object per se, but if you're just moving or rotating something around and trying to get an idea of what it looks like at a specific position, then this is perfectly fine. One thing to keep in mind though, and we're going to get into freezing the transformations in a second, but if you leave a polygon object, you leave any object for that matter, and you free rotate it and you leave it in its position, keep in mind that if you freeze the transformations, which we're going to get into why it's useful to do that, then now you've lost the ability to go back to that rotation axis, to go back to the original rotation axis that the polygon cube had, because now this is its true 0. You've frozen the transformation, so now everything's set to 0. And if you wanted to get it back, you would have to basically start figuring out how to get it back, which is not very good. So I'm just undoing a couple of times. So let's go ahead and highlight all this, because when you do not freeze the transformations, and as long as you have everything set, you can click and drag down and just type 0 and it'll get it back to its home position. Same thing with the scale tool. You could grab by the center and uniformly scale. You can type, say you want it to be 2.25 units, scaled in all axes. You can do that as well. You can go back in and type 1. You can scale along one axis. You can do any number of transformations as well. So that's the scale as well. Now let's say that we wanted to, let's talk about freezing the transformations for a second. So I'm going to just kind of flow this around and why it's useful to keep this in mind. So we have this polygon object up here. And one scenario we would not have it in the 0, 0, 0 would be if you had interactive creation set. When you would create the object, it would be wherever you created it, not where Maya would place it if you turned off the interactive creation. So in that case, you would have this object here, and say you duplicated this, you do Control D, and I'm just going to move this around, and you had it here. So what if you wanted to get this polygon cube back to the position where it came from? Well, right now you would have to look at the channel box and look at your translate X, Y, and Z, the original ones, and then look at the new ones, X, Y, and Z, and then you'd have to match them. You have to go in and say, okay, that's 6.857. You go in and type that here, and et cetera, et cetera. That's, needless to say, really not a good way to do it. There's two different ways that we're going to do this, and I'll just show you the first one. So what we would want to do is, if we want to work around, if this is going to be this object's permanent position, I'm going to delete that. What we want to do is freeze the transformations, because then that will reset it to 0, and it will allow us to now work from this position instead of the 0, 0, 0, because we can always reference back to this. So I'm going to go ahead and just go up to Modify, all the way at the top, and I set a hotkey for this because this one's one that you use very regularly as well. And you go to Freeze Transformations. And so right away when you click it, you can see that your channel box is now reset to 0 on its translate X, Y, and Z, and the rotates as well. And if this had been scaled, and I did that again, Modify Freeze Transformations, it would reset it to 1 again. So because now that's its new position. So I'm going to duplicate this again now and go and just move it wherever. I'm just going to drag it up in space. So now if we know that this is the reference home object and we want to get this back here, one way we could do it would be just to highlight all the translates and type 0. And now we know that it's back here. You would want to go up to Window, Outliner, which we described in the last session. And here you can see your Polycube 1 and Polycube 2. So, when you have two objects on top of each other, you may not know that, because if you do a crossing window, you're actually selecting both of them. And you go to move it, and you may not notice that you have two of them on top of each other. But if you look at your outliner, you can very easily tell that you have one and another one right on top of it. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete that. So that's one way to do it. You can have it set and freeze the transformations and then bring the object back. Another way would be to use it with the pivots. So I'm going to talk about the pivots and the snap. And so you notice that right now the pivot of this object is based around its centroid. It's based around the boundary box. It's right in the center. So if we wanted to move this from this position to, say, this corner or any one of the vertices on this polygon object, we would have to use our object snaps for this. So if we go up top where the icons are, right below the menus, you can see that there's a series of ones that look like magnets, and those are your snaps. So if you go with the third from the left, the one with a little magnet and a ball, that's your vertex snap. So as soon as you enable that, if you look at your manipulator, you'll notice that the manipulator center went from a square to a circle. And that's because the vertex snap has been enabled. So once that happens, if you just click and drag, then you'll notice that it'll jump from wherever it's at directly to the closest vertex where you pointed your mouse. And I'm not holding anything but the left mouse button, and you'll notice that it's snapping. It only will snap, and it will only move to a vertex position. So, of course, now you can't get it out unless you turn your vertex snap off. So a better way to do this, if you hold the V, as in Victor, the V key, that is the built-in default for the vertex snap. And you notice that if I press and hold the V key, the square would turn to a circle, but also the Vertex Snap is enabled up top. What I like about doing this versus going up and clicking the Vertex Snap is that you can use it when you need it and release it when you don't, and you don't have to remember to take it off. So you hold the V and you do the same thing, and it's snapping to each vertex. But as soon as you let go of the V, then you're back to being able to move this freely or move it along an axis. So that's a bit more useful. You'll use a Vertex Snap a lot, nonstop. So keep that in mind. You'll always want to start to get used to your hand position on the keyboard. The V consequently is to the right of the Alt, and so you normally have your thumb on the Alt and your pointer finger on the V. So one issue though is, okay, well, we can move this from this position and the center to this vertex, but what if we wanted to move this polygon object from this position to the vertex so it lines up directly next to it? Well, you certainly wouldn't want to go and start doing this and grabbing, and saying that looks close, because then when you move over here, you realize it's not remotely close. So one way to do this is by changing the pivot position. Right now it's set to the center. If we hold the D or the insert key for the PC keyboards, or you can do the D as well, the letter D will activate your ability to change the pivot manipulator. So you notice that now it went from the square with the arrows on the manipulator to when you hold D, it goes to square with a little looks like a target, and there's no arrows on the ends. That means that you've now turned on the pivot position, manipulator, and you're able to change its position. So you hold the letter D and you can move this around wherever, and if you let it go, then now this is the new pivot position for this object. So once again, if I hold V and snap, and that will snap to the vertices, but you notice it's still not where we want it to be. So we want to get the pivot manipulator to the vertex. And the way we do that is by holding the letter D and holding the letter V at the same time. So D and V, and then as soon as we go to move, it will start snapping to the vertices. So as soon as we get it to the position we want, we can let it go. And then we can now just do the V alone, not with the D. And then that will snap it to the vertex position we want. So it's very useful. It's a nice way to have a lot of control over how you position your geometry. If you're working with other programs, something like Rhino, where you can input specific coordinates and move it along that way, this is a bit different because you have the free manipulator. You have an ability to basically just move it wherever you'd like. So by having the vertex snaps, you can snap it directly to any object. So so once we have this selected, and say we have it here, what if we're not interested in now maintaining this polygon object's pivot position in the this top corner vertex? We want it to go back to the center because we may not always want it from this position. So what you have to do at this point is you have to center the pivot. And you can do the center pivot by going up to Modify and down to Center Pivot. I recommend doing a hotkey for this as well. I've set the letter C for this. Because once you do that, then you can center that object's pivot, and if you need to move it to another position, then you can just do that again by holding D and V. And then you can go back and modify center pivot. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. We can also do a grid snap. So that would be the letter X, or going up to the magnet with the grid. So you can see it here. That's going to snap along the grid. So if you wanted to, right now if you don't turn it off, then it's going to stay on. But if you just use the X key, then you can move it along the grid. If you do D to change the pivot and V to move the pivot to the vertex of the object, then now you've set that here, then you can hold X and snap directly on the grid, like so. Same thing with, there's a curve snap as well. And we'll talk about creating the curves later, but I'm just gonna go ahead and just show you this now. So I went to create curve tool. I opened the dialog box, specified the degree, and I'm just gonna draw this. Don't worry about getting the specifics of that. And if you wanted to snap to the curve, then you would need to hold the, then you would need to go to the curve snap, which is right here. And that, by default, the C is the curve snap. But I changed the C to be my center pivot in the hotkeys. So you can do whichever one you like. You can select the curve snap. You rarely snap to the curves, but just to show you, you can press the curve snap and use the middle mouse button, click and hold it, and you want to kind of fish it in there. It takes a kind of bit of wiggling, but it gets it in there. So you can see I'm holding the middle mouse button, and it's basically moving it along that curve as I'm dragging it through. So I'm going to turn it off, turn the curve snap off, delete the curve, and I'm going to center my pivot, and I want to get this back, highlight all this back to 0, 0, 0, which was over here when we froze the transformations. And if you remember, F will bring that object into focus here in the frame. It will frame around the object. And one last thing, if you want to change the size of the manipulator, you can press the plus or minus key on your keyboard, and that will change the size of it. So if it's too big or too small, you can change it, enlarge it,